Hey, welcome to current listeners and to new listeners. We discuss here the intersections of society, culture, and more of a philosophical depth. Although we try to remain as academic as possible and relied upon the individuals to take part in how this reflects their personal life. I think we're going to discuss right now the empathetic urge, particularly in the space of proving to be the worthwhile endeavor of a proposition of individuality and their existential recommendation, as it were. We don't really have the mechanisms to recognize that which is worthwhile of an endeavor to propagate and that which is less so, or less worthwhile in its expense ratio to that which is worthwhile. We don't have the metrics available to us, especially in concerning social aspects. We may have some frameworks, but nothing concrete to deliberately distinguish in a hierarchical manner the aspects of substantiation and that which is unsubstantiated or less so, and a distraction of concurrent experience or intersection of experience. For this reason, the empathetic urge somehow surfaces as the material that is both concrete, since empathy is existent, manifesting in a organic and natural manner, to then propose that which one is empathetic towards is worthwhile of platforming as an aspect, as a social being, as a method of recognition. This line of inquiry is commendable in the namesake of what the empathetic urge is, that which correlates to the individual stature. It's the most recognizable to the individual because it is most alike the individual. Yet, it is very well the ability to concoct a domestic sentiment of certain likeness value despite the very different nature of their origin. We could create something artificial that offers such semblance that all our empathetic capacities will take part in engineering the concern of that counterpoint despite the very distinguishable nature of that origin. This is not alone in the arena of non-organic manifestations. Even a social being themselves can purport likeness in a manner that urges the empathetic urge that correlates to the individual who partakes in such a social being, that one might assume that such is of similar origin and deserving of a platform. Specifically, the reason that we want to propositionalize the counterpoints that serve the empathetic sentiment is because if it is likeness, then it is of same origin, and being of same origin, it deserves, not only deserves, but it is required of protection because of the genealogy of oneself in that process. The true concern of the counterpoint is not the degeneration of likeness, but the degeneration of its origin, based on the fact that there is likeness. If we remove the origin, then the individual themselves finds inhospitable ground to serve on, because they've ruined the capacity of their genealogy, which this likeness takes place. It is the antiquated version of, or it is rather in reference to the antiquated version of relative bonds, where the familial space deserves protection not because of some likeness of concern, but rather because the genealogy from which one is sourced needs to be protected so as to continue unabated in the stature of themselves as afforded in that likeness. It is not the likeness itself that demands protectionism, but rather the genealogy of that likeness. If we conclude this to be the rational thought for the proposition of empathy towards protectionism, then it is only a step further to realize that if there is misalignment between the empathetic urge and the origin, that it is not the same likeness, but rather a simulated or a non-organic likeness that doesn't prove same source genealogy, then we need to remove the sensibility of that empathetic urge in lieu of protecting that which is of similar origin, despite this mechanism calling for a different order, because the mechanism is not utilizing its metric in a proper manner, that of the rational thought that proposes itself to the origin of that empathetic likeness. Therefore, because of such a premise, if a social being develops themselves in a manner that compares likeness but is of different origin, has a different genealogy, then the protective mechanism should not be utilized, since one is not protecting themselves, which is the only purpose of protectionism, because it is not same source material. This would be the same conclusion whether it is an artificial creation of likeness or a social being that has developed a likeness despite a different origin. Now we can understand the ability of non-organic likeness because it can be the social creation that imbues likeness, such as a inputted memory of likeness despite the inhabitant source not being of likeness. That it could be a creation of man in some sense through the unorganic likeness. The more pressing issue is a social being themselves appearing in likeness despite the very fact that their genealogy is of different origin. This can be done almost as simply by one inputting their own memory base contrary to the existential development, meaning they've assumed a proprietary knowledge base of memory that supposes itself as likeness, despite the very fact that there is no true likeness, because the genealogy, the origin of that likeness, is the attempt of simulation to the likeness rather than likeness itself. This does not mean that the mechanism of the empathetic urge shouldn't be utilized to gain an awareness of what constitutes protection and what should be neglected of such, but merely to suppose that it is a method that contains its vulnerabilities. One can then apply a secondary method to overcome this vulnerability by recognizing the genealogy of that likeness, to suppose if it is to serve as the method of empathy and thus for protectionism. However, this requires a different aptitude because it may be difficult at the first instance to realize the likeness is of different origin unless one is deeply embedded in the self-same awareness of that likeness to a point where small discrepancies allow one to realize those differences. However, this usurps the entire premise of the empathetic method, because if one is so self-aware of their likeness that any discrepancy will be unfounded, then they will be met with already the method to distinguish origin versus non-origin without that necessity of empathy. Empathy is merely there to suppose itself, in which one does not realize their own likeness, so that in parallel to other likeness, the empathy motivation, the empathetic motivation, is consistent to determine those differentiations. More so than even this, to compound on this prospect, there is the case of a non-empathetic urge which is still of the same origin, because it is possible that one does not expose themselves in a performance of likeness, but because there's high distance or other differentiations, while still maintaining a direct genealogy and origin for which protectionism should suppose itself. With all this being said, it would be assumed that one either utilize the method of empathy in an environment where there is a avoidance of creating likeness, whether in artificial manifestations or in one's social being, meaning where integrity is paramount of a trait, for then the empathetic urge works most prevalent. But in the case where integrity is not of high source and likeness is a matter of creation, whether for the social being themselves or for other non-organic manifestations, then the empathetic urge is not to be utilized, despite the sentimentality of such. The same can be said for the case of non-empathy, where in a realm of lack of integrity, in a realm where honesty is not prevalent and where there is multitudes of composition to likeness that are contrary to the origin of one's existential stature, then one must be privy to those that don't find themselves in empathetic connection, because it is very possible that they have been in avoidance to the proposal of likeness for its usurping sentimentality and the lack of integrity that surrounds such propositions, despite their origin being of similar proportion, meaning to say that it is specifically that which is not aligned empathetically that might be most concerning as source, genealogy, and worthwhile of protectionism. Thus, the distinguishing element of these two methods is, in the case of high integrity versus low integrity, where high integrity resolves itself with simply the empathetic urge, and low integrity resolves itself outside empathetic urge, and specifically in the worthwhile cases where empathy is not existent, because it is very possible that it has been demoted despite its prevalence of similar origin. Thank you for listening, and I hope you subscribe. Leave a review so I get to know my audience better, and thank you for listening again.